Let's talk about the 4 phases of Mormon patriotism. I hope all of you are ready for a very patriotic week. Those of you in the United States, later this weekend are commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Though I will note, as the historical nerd that always has to add factoids, the Continental Congress actually declared independence on July 2nd, a day that John Adams believed that all future citizens would celebrate with fireworks and aplomb. But it was July 4th when they finished the written Declaration of Independence, editing the document that Thomas Jefferson had written. There's something about the written text that Americans celebrate. And don't worry, I'm going to be commemorating the 250th this Friday with a video on new books on the American Revolution, so stay tuned for that. But I thought I'd start out the week by tracing the quixotic and evolving history of how Mormons have acted as American patriots. I'm recording this video only a couple miles away from where the Stadium of Fire is going to take place this weekend, one of the largest patriotic celebrations of the nation. And Mormons are largely known as uber patriots, but that has not always been the case. So in this video, I want to briefly outline what I call the 4 phases of Mormon patriotism. Early Republic exuberance, theocratic dissent as number 2, unbridled Christian nationalism as number 3, and qualified cosmopolitanism as number 4. Now, a few qualifications or hesitations on these categories. They often bleed into one another. They're not always systematic. You'll find people expressing ideas that fit in one theme in different eras and so forth. That this is hardly from a full delineated, categorized movement. History doesn't work that way. But I do think it's a useful way to chart how Mormonism has evolved over the past 200 years of the 250 United States years in their uneven and complicated path toward American assimilation. In other words, I think looking at how Mormons have evolved in being patriots tells us a lot about Mormonism. It also tells us a lot about American religion. So let's dig in. So we're going to start with early Republic exuberance, because it's easy to forget that when the Latter-day Saint tradition was founded, America was still a young experiment, an experiment that most Americans took pride in. Note for how that's going to shift in the Latter-day Saints later. Most Latter-day Saints, including Joseph Smith, were either the children or grandchildren of revolutionary patriots, a point that they often brought up. Lucy Mack Smith, in her famous memoir, spends a considerable chunk in the first part of her story detailing how both sides of her family fought bravely in the American Revolution as a way to show that they have a claim, a stake in the American experiment, that they are true patriots. And one of the things they truly celebrated was religious freedom, because that is what enabled upstart sects like the Latter-day Saints to begin, that there was no established church. All churches were granted an opportunity to grow. That disestablishment, the word scholars use to explain the separation between church and state, enabled these churches that otherwise would have been marginalized or kicked out. But democratization of religion and the disestablishment also raised a number of problems. It opened up a hermeneutical crisis, of some scholars have called it, for Joseph Smith, that there are so many religions out there. Which one is right? Well, the American response is to create your own. But it also raised questions for those outside the faith. Now that the government is not going to be intervening and determining which faiths are safe, which faiths belong in America, it's going to be left to the common citizens. And that's what a lot of those who oppose the Latter-day Saints are going to draw on. They will define Mormonism not as a religion, but as a fraudulent, pretended faith, therefore not worthy of religious protections. And that's what results in the Latter-day Saints being kicked out of Missouri in 1833, for instance. And it's in that moment that we get some of the crucial texts when we look at this exuberant patriotism from the early Mormons, because Joseph Smith dictates several revelations, notably those that become canonized as D&C 98 and D&C 101, that sacralize the Constitution, particular parts of the Constitution. I'll just quote from D&C 101 to give you a taste. Quote, "For this purpose have I established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men, whom I've raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood. Now, this is a sentiment that's found across many early Americans, but it is now embedded within the LDS canon, this notion of God inspiring the Constitution and raising up these wise men. And the Latter-day Saints have therefore long interpreted these passages as in this Christian nationalist lens, to where this is a chosen nation with God's chosen leaders. Now, we're going to qualify that a bit later, but you can see the origins of that interpretive tradition. And of course, Joseph Smith continues to draw from that well, trying to take advantage of the American political system and celebrating the liberties it enables. When he runs for president in Nauvoo, after the walls are starting to close in on them, they can't trust state authorities, his campaign pamphlet positions on the federal government that potential candidate Lieutenant General Joseph Smith presents is in very uber patriotic language. He also does another appeal to the mountain boys of Vermont, his birth state, where again he draws from his patriotic lineage. Now, a few legacies I want to highlight from this exuberant, patriotic early republic period that still stay today. The conflict that Mormons had with their neighbors were often understood in the Mormon terms as the true patriots versus the false patriots. They were trying to out-patriot their opponents, saying that we are the ones that truly belong. They also had sincere faith and deep trust in the Constitution and its promises, especially of religious liberty. This is the period where you get a lot of quotes from the early leaders sacralizing the Constitution, which is going to lay the foundation for those who come later. However, even as Joseph Smith is running for president, he is also paving the way for a new path for Latter-day Saints to take when they lose trust in that very constitutional and democratic system. Before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this nerdy historical content, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. I try to put out deep dives on topics every Monday. I connect the past to the present on Wednesday, either through politics or film or media or new announcements. And then on Fridays, I pull back the curtain, talk about the historian's craft, engage new books, interview authors, revisit classics, or look at the sources behind the historical arguments so that you too can become a historical expert. And if you want to give back to this channel, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to give back, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to videos, you get little icons next to your name when you leave comments, but most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing, rigorous scholarship. You can also follow me on different platforms, especially Instagram, where I do supplemental videos and photos. And you can subscribe to my free kit newsletter, where I send out links, announcements, and updates, and just a few weeks. I promise I don't spam your inbox. So when you do register, you need to make sure to rescue the confirmation email out of your spam. Also, one last announcement. If you enjoy this topic that I'm outlining today, the broad contours of Mormon patriotic expression, please mark your calendar for September 24th this fall in Logan, Utah, where I will be delivering the Leonard J. Arrington Lecture on Mormon history and culture, one of the great named lectures in the Mormon academic world. My lecture will be titled Declarations of Interdependence, Why the Latter-day Saints Just Can't Quit the United States. I go much deeper in the story, and it's going to include a bit of a reader's theater. It's going to be lots of fun. I'm excited. So if you are able to go, mark your calendar for September 24th, 2026 this fall in Logan, Utah for the Arrington Lecture. Anyways, let's get back to today's topic. So Joseph Smith ends up being a bridge figure, moving from one phase, the exuberant early republic patriotism, to the second phase, which is theocratic dissent, because even as he is running for president on a Democratic ticket, not Democrat in capital D, but lower key Democrat, he's also envisioning something else. He declares his presidency in January of 44. By March of 44, he sets up a secret theocratic council known as the Council of 50. As I've done videos on the Council of 50 before, I'll try to keep this brief, but I want to focus on some of the key elements. The Council of 50, as in Joseph Smith's own words and the words who participated, went far beyond just frustration with the current administration of the American government and toward critiquing the very principles upon which the American government was founded. Smith declared that all nations that failed to recognize God's law would fail. And that's why they wrote a brand new constitution. You can go watch my Constitution Day video from last fall, where I talk about this Constitution from the Council of 50. This dynamic, of course, becomes worse after Joseph Smith is killed in June of 1844, which they saw as the last straw of separating themselves from the American nation. The Council of 50 records for the next year, 1845, are replete with quotes from Brigham Young, Amos Lyman, Heber C. Kimball, and others declaring America a failed experiment, and the U.S. Constitution not just in force, but flawed from the beginning because it did not recognize God's priesthood authority. And so they consciously chose to escape the United States. And what's so notable is Parley Pratt, one of the most prominent apostles, even drafted a Declaration of Independence published in one of the church's newspapers on the East Coast, using the same language from Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, but now declaring the saints' independence from the United States. Now, of course, there are paradoxes to this, because as the saints move out to what was then northern Mexico, rejecting the United States, the U.S. was entering into a war. They were invading Mexico in order to acquire their land. And within a few years, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Utah Territory was now part of the United States. And this lingering patriotism that the Mormons had from their exuberant early Republic period never fully goes away. It's kind of these mixed allegiances. They wanted to create their own theocratic empire, but pragmatically, they had to do so within the confines of the United States. And that tension becomes all the more acute during the fights over polygamy, where Latter-day Saints argued that polygamy was their sincere religious belief and therefore should be protected by the Constitution. The federal government, conversely, argued that it was a degradation of morality and therefore had to be stamped out. And one of my and this is during in the 1870s. You might remember Wilford Woodruff as, having the vision of the founding fathers coming to him and asking for ordinances, and say, well, that's an example of the exuberant patriotism. Yeah, that's certainly the legacies of patriotism still with them. But think about how Woodruff is using that story to the saints' advantage. They're trying to say that the founding fathers actually agree with us, not the government. Our allegiance is to those wise men originally, even if they created a flawed constitutional system, which they were still insisting on. And then in the next decade, in 1886, after the federal government starts prosecuting the polygamists, and Mormon leaders have to go on the underground as fugitives from the law, the 4th of July celebration in 1886 featured all Latter-day Saints lowering their flags to half-mast. Eliza R. Snow wrote a funeral dirge, and they commemorated the death of American liberty. A little bit of different vibe than what I think we'll see at the Stadium of Fire. So, of course, Latter-day Saints end up moving away from that after 1890, when they forfeit polygamy, at least publicly, and they adopt the two-party system, and they start marching toward cultural assimilation. But several legacies remain from the theocratic dissent era. It's from this era where you get a lot of quotes of leaders saying that if the laws of God and the laws of man conflict, I'm following the laws of God. It's also during this period where you get plenty of quotes denouncing the United States as a failed government and critiquing the Constitution for not actually protecting their liberties. In other words, whenever you see quotes that are trotted out about the Latter-day Saints being anti-United States, they're often coming from this period, the phase of theocratic dissent, even while some patriotism is still lingering, only to be reborn once they reach a new phase. Because after 1890, the Latter-day Saints tried to make up for lost time, trying to emphasize that they are truly devoted American patriots as a way to overcome the conflicts of the previous decade. Expressing patriotism was a way to prove their belonging within the United States. This is a common theme throughout America, where those on the margins often overcompensate to pull themselves to the center. And Mormonism, once seen as devoutly opposed to Americanism, then becomes presented as its fulfillment. And this slowly starts happening over the early 20th century, but of course reaches its apotheosis in people like Ezra Taft Benson, the LDS apostle who serves as Secretary of Agriculture to Dwight Eisenhower, as well as Cleon Skousen, one of the most prominent Mormon thinkers and writers and speakers during the 20th century. Both resurrect Joseph Smith's early teachings and the church's teachings from the exuberant early republic period of sacralizing the Constitution. Both drew from and expanded the Christian nationalist movement that was becoming quite influential during the post-World War II era. Benson taught that the Constitution was quasi-scripture and that the founders were inspired men. And Cleon Skousen even wrote textbooks that package this Mormon teaching of the founding for the broader American Republic, the nation, as seen in his textbook his study book, The Miracle of America, or his best-selling book, The 5,000-Year Leap. But just to give you a taste of this era, I'm going to quote from Ezra Taft Benson when he spoke around the bicentennial of the United States that captures this vibe. Quote, "The destiny of America was divinely decreed. The events which established our great nation were foreknown to God and revealed to prophets of old. As in an enacted drama, the players who came on the scene were rehearsed and selected for their parts. Their talents, abilities, capacities, and weaknesses were known before they were born." You can see this idea of the hand of God being deeply involved in creating America, that it's more than just having those principles enshrined in the Constitution. It's the Constitution itself and those who wrote it who were part of God's plan. And you can see some lasting echoes of these types of ideas in people like Tim Ballard, whose books posthumously baptized the Pilgrims and George Washington and Abraham Lincoln as closeted Mormons, or in the painter John McNaughton and his One Nation Under God, this idea of a very Aaron Eckhart-looking Jesus Christ holding up the Constitution, representing that this is God's chosen nation. And obviously, there are a lot of legacies that are going to come from this unbridled Christian nationalism phase. It embeds Mormons within the Christian nationalist movement. It allows them a seat at the table of the religious right, though with an asterisk, as I've been highlighting recently about how many evangelicals are still not too comfortable with that. And it's still very dominant among Latter-day Saints. I imagine that many of the cultural, local expressions of patriotism this week with the 4th of July, they're very much going to be along this vein. But what's notable is that to a close observer, there has been a shift, even while the local Mormon culture continues to practice this unbridled Christian nationalist spirit. At the LDS institutional level, there has been a change to something that's a little more nuanced. And that's because this Christian nationalist perspective takes on added problems for the modern church in at least two ways. One is it embeds the faith within particular partisan views that are not fully accepted by the mainstream. And two, it's an awkward fit in a church that's increasingly global and should not be tethered to a particular historical and national context. And so over the last few decades, and led by Dallin H, who was an influential apostle and now is president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we see a shift in that official rhetoric, even while the Christian nationalist rhetoric is still very alive at the local level. You can see this shifting view of the Constitution in a couple addresses by Dallin H that I've touched on briefly in previous videos, but I thought I'd repackage here. First, in a long essay that appeared in a February 1992 issue of the Ensign, directly combating some of the ideas of Ezra Taft Benson. It was titled The Divinely Inspired Constitution, which is a title that Ezra Taft Benson would be fully on board with. But then he nuances the argument. Here are some key quotes. "It was a miracle that the Constitution could be drafted and ratified. But what is there in the text of the Constitution that is divinely inspired? Reverence for the United States Constitution is so great that sometimes individuals speak as if its every word and phrase has the same standing as Scripture. Personally, I have never considered it necessary to defend every line of the Constitution as Scripture. For example, I find nothing scriptural in the compromise on slavery or the minimum ages of citizenship for congressmen, senators, or president. And I could go on. I recommend going to check out that full essay if you're interested. This may seem subtle, but it's important because it's pulling back from the exuberant Christian nationalist phrase where everything of the Constitution, everything of the founders is sacralized, and looking at particular principles. And you can see this shifted even more, especially now in the global context, in a recent address from the April 2021 General Conference from Oaks titled Defending Our Divinely Inspired Constitution. Again, note the name. That seems like it fits in the previous phase, but is now pointing towards something else because he emphasizes that while it might seem odd to celebrate the US Constitution in a global conference, he insists that the message is universal, because he says it's the principles of religious freedom that are inspired, not the entirety of the Constitution, just the principles of religious freedom. And that idea of religious liberty is, quote, the common heritage of constitutions across the world. So note this push toward a cosmopolitan interpretation. This is what I mean by qualified cosmopolitanism. And we can see this in place in the LDS Church's recent Fifth Sunday lesson here in the United States that did not deify the founding fathers, although it might have happened in some local congregations. It did not call the Constitution scripture. Instead, it emphasized a principle, religious liberty, that they argue was born out of the Constitution, but now does not wholly belong to the Constitution. It belongs to the world. This is an interpretation that matches a more nuanced, mainstream institutional view, as well as a church that is much more global, kind of severing that Christian nationalist vein that had dominated the church so much up until just a few recent decades ago. I'll close with just a couple videos that I think capture this dynamic of the shift over the last century. Here's a picture of the Salt Lake Temple being draped by a grand American flag, the largest American flag stitched up until that point. This is to celebrate U.S. statehood. The flag first was draped from the interior of the Salt Lake Tabernacle, then draped from the side of the Salt Lake Temple. But now if you look at the side of Temple Square, it's not a big American flag, it's lots of global flags from nations around the world, showing this shift from trying to slowly detangle the faith from that Christian nationalism. So, let me know what you think about the four phases, if they make sense to you: the exuberant early republic, the theocratic dissent, the unbridled Christian nationalism, and now qualified cosmopolitanism. Again, these are blurry boundaries. You might find people and quotes that fit in one theme but appear in a different chronology, but I think overall the narrative works. Let me know what I missed. And if you want a more detailed version, make sure to mark your calendar for my Leonard Arrington lecture on September 24th in Logan, Utah. History has never been more relevant than it is today. As Americans commemorate the semi-quincentennial of the nation's founding, we are having to come to grips with what it means to be American, and Mormons are having to come to grips with what it means to be a Mormon within America. And that very question has evolved over the years, and studying that tells us a lot about the faith as well as the nation that birthed it.